I want to talk about this week's gospel reading a little bit. It is a continuation of last week when the disciples have talked with Jesus or asked Jesus about if a member of the church, one of your community members, sins against you. What do you do? How do you resolve that conflict? And this week's reading or section is a continuation of that. And in Matthew's version of this story, Peter says, well, how many times am I expected to forgive? Like 7 times? And he's thinking that that's an exorbitant amount. And Jesus says, of course, no, not 7 times, 77 times. And I just want to make sure that we all fully understand, I'm sure, that Jesus does not mean in that teaching that when he says 77 times, that if someone offends against you and it's time number 78, that then you just write that person off or something like that. That's not what is happening here. Jesus, I think, is exaggerating this what Peter already thinks is an exaggeration, and Jesus is pushing that much further about. It suggests to me how we Christians have to go the extra mile and go the extra 500 miles in alleviating the suffering that we see around us and that we see in other people's lives. And he gets there by using this parable. And this parable uses real life stuff, money, debt, to make a particular point. This servant, slave who owes the king, he owes an unpayable amount. Let me just quickly think about the math. One talent is 6,000 denarii. Denarii was the standard wage for, an average wage for a day's work. So for this fellow to actually pay off the debt he owes his master, it's not actually payable. It would take him 24 years, if I've done that math correctly, it would take him about 24 years worth of wages to pay off this debt to the king. And so the king has invited the servant through his forgiveness of this debt, unexpected forgiveness, has invited this slave into a different kind of world, a different way of being in the world. A different kind of world, a world that is founded on empathy, compassion, forgiveness, grace. He has been invited into a different world. I think a lot of us can have, if we think about our lives, most of us also have experiences of debt that cannot be repaid. Not necessarily in monetary ways, but other kinds of debt. I could never repay the debt to my parents for all that they did for me and growing up and all that. I think a lot of us have people in our lives. I think at the number of folks as a part of the church that have been so kind and wonderful and supportive and helpful at difficult times in my own life. I've seen the same thing at play in difficult times in other people's lives. We all have these debts that we can't necessarily repay. So the king has invited the slave into a different kind of world, a world where score doesn't get kept, where a tally isn't counted. It's just this world, as I said, full of empathy, grace, love, forgiveness. And how does the slave respond to that then? Does he go from this encounter, this freeing experience he has just had, and carry that same joy, that same hopefulness, that same, in a sense, rebirth out into the lives of the people that he meets and the people around him? And no, he doesn't. He, of course, chooses, even though he has just had this firsthand experience of grace, he chooses to then go out into the world and continue to operate in the old way, with the old world kind of way of doing things, where you owe me this, and you owe me that, and you owe me this, and there is no forgiveness, and you have to pay, and he goes right back into that. Paul, one of the lines of Paul that is so often misquoted and misinterpreted and all that, Paul puts the choice that we see in this parable, he puts it so very starkly. Paul, that one little line of Paul that says, "The wages of sin is death." It's really clear, really simple. And think about that line of Paul in the light of this parable. The slave has been invited into a new way of being that has been shared and extended to him, and he chooses to go back to the old way. And so this creates for me, I think it raises for me, for all of us, questions about the kind of world we want to live in. And a lot of the things going on in the world right now seem to be exactly about how do we want the world to be? What do we want the world to look like as we move forward? And so, whether it's environmental and ecological issues, whether it's social issues, there are issues around racial justice, there are all sorts of issues going on right now. And this parable is saying, what kind of world do we want to be a part of? I want to be a part of a world that is founded on love and empathy, a world that actually values other people. I don't want to be part of, some world where people are beating each other up and burning everyone all their stuff down and all. I don't want any part of that kind of world. I'm not sure that any of us can live in that kind of world. I want a world that's founded on justice, compassion, forgiveness, the values that God has repeatedly through history over the centuries and over eons tried to get us to understand. And so for each one of us in our day-to-day today lives and interactions with people, the grocery store, the gas station, I know that because of COVID, we all have fewer and fewer interactions with people, but those precious few interactions that we have with people, maybe we can think of, do we keep score in our relationships? Maybe it's with family members or co-workers. Do we keep score? Do we keep a tally? Do we, when someone we feel has wronged us or offended us, is our first thought about how are we going to get even? How are we going to get revenge? Or are we big enough people, loving enough people, gentle enough people? We can just absorb some of that and say, well, sometimes some people are having a bad day. Maybe sometimes some people are a little bit snarky or, say unkind things and horrible remarks, and maybe they're just having a bit of a bad day. Can I be big enough to just absorb that? Can I follow Jesus' example enough to not snark back? It's all about choosing what kind of world do I want to be a part of creating. And that, I guess, has for me everything to do with my commitment to Jesus and his vision and what God has proposed and laid out for us. I want that kind of world. That's the world this parable is pointing us toward. Amen.